Okay, good morning class. Hope you're having a good day today. Here we go again. This is week 3. I believe today is session number 5. I think we've met 4 times. My semester's flying on by like a freight train. So, yeah, thank you very much. Did everybody sign the roll here? Okay. Good. Thank you very much, Caleb. Appreciate that. Okay, if ever you miss the roll, catch me after class, be sure you sign in, okay? So I'll know who's here. Okay, so last time we introduced, I guess being the 4th session of class, we introduced chapter 3. So we're moving along all right, at a decent clip. We want to focus a little more on chapter 3 perhaps than maybe any other chapter in the course. Chapter 3 is so fundamental. We introduce how markets work in chapter 3. We all associate the word supply and demand with economics. And so we talked last time about demand when we introduced chapter 3. We'll turn to supply here in just a minute. You are a demander of a good if you are willing and what? Willing and able purchase a good. So you have to have 2 things there to be a demander for the good. And so when we talk about the demand for Toyotas or Ford F-150s or what have you, or bushels of wheat, whatever the commodity might be you're looking at when you're talking about the demand, you're looking at the number of units people out there are willing, both willing and able to purchase. And so the word demand and changing demand and so forth, those terms are used kind of loosely by folks out there on the street. We have to tighten that a little bit down in this course because we're looking at a little deeper level at how markets behave. In particular, with the demand side, there's a difference between change in quantity demanded and change in demand, okay? So remember last time we mentioned change in quantity demanded is a movement along a demand curve. So let's talk about a demand curve just a second, just a little recap. I don't want to spend but just a couple more minutes or so on this because we want to launch into supply. But the law of demand says that for really any commodity or any good, the price of that good and the quantity that people are willing and able to purchase, that is the quantity demanded, are inversely related. When one goes up, when the price goes up, the quantity that people are willing and able to purchase is going to go down. So we had a way of sketching that in a system of prices versus quantity. So we had price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. We noted that it's price that determines quantity demanded, not the other way around. So the independent variable, remember us talking about that, the independent variable is on the vertical axis. That's the price. Price determines, after all, it's the price of gasoline that determines the quantity of gasoline you as a consumer will purchase, okay? As a consumer, you alone don't have, it's a very competitive market, you don't have the power to influence the price of gasoline. Now, a lot of consumers coming together can affect the price of gasoline, but to explain that causation, we have to look at market equilibrium, and we will in a little bit when we slap the supply curve on there. But strictly speaking, this law of demand goes from prices to quantity demanded, not the other way around. It's price that determines quantity demanded. That's the causal relationship. And so price is the independent variable. And so we sketched the demand curve, and we talked about why the demand curve is downward sloping. That is why prices and quantities demanded are inversely related. And we gave 3 reasons why. So just kind of a quick recap, okay? So let's talk about the law of demand. Okay, here if you can read my writing this morning, we'll go to the dot cam. And so price and quantity demanded are inversely related, okay? All right, so when we say that they're inversely related, we are saying when one goes up, the other goes down. And so when we sketch this, oh, by the way, be careful here, we have a comma here and said ceteris paribus, right? Ceteris paribus. All other things are equal. So you don't change anything else about the market, okay? You only allow for price and quantity to change, quantity demanded. So we sketch price on the vertical axis, quantity here, and we had a downward sloping curve. And I guess if you use a little q here instead of a big Q, you could talk about an individual demander, one person out there. The quantity of gasoline that they would demand in a month or a week, we looked at some numbers last time, would be affected by the price. So if the price, say, is $5 a gallon, they may only be willing to purchase 10 gallons in a week and so forth. And so if the price decreases, individual consumers willing to purchase more. Remember we used, but this is ceteris paribus. That is, if this individual demander doesn't experience a raise in income or anything like that. Now remember, we went from here to the market demand, okay? We added across several consumers and we got market demand, so I'll use a capital Q here. And we used horizontal addition here to get basically the same relationship, if you will. It's just pushed out to the right. So we looked at a hypothetical situation where you had 3 demanders on one side. Still got a negative relationship here. Okay, so why the law of demand? Okay, why is there this negative relationship between prices and quantity demanded? And so be sure you remember these. We talked about price is an obstacle. Okay, whoops, obstacle. Obstacle, you got to overcome that. Price is an obstacle. 2, we talked about diminishing marginal utility. Without going back through this again, okay? But we were talking about how the second pancake is not as good as the first and so forth. Diminishing marginal, utility. If you can read my writing today. And 3, very important here, we talked about the substitution and income effects. Substitution and income effects. So if the price of gasoline goes up here, from $3 a gallon to $5 a gallon, wow, that's gonna, man, nobody wants to see that, right? So if that happens, a couple things kicks in. First off, gasoline becomes relatively more expensive with respect to other goods, okay? So people substitute away from gasoline. They may buy bus tickets instead, or they may take their bicycle to work, find other ways of commuting to work and school. So that's called the substitution effect, okay? The second thing is the income effect. And what is that? Well, when the price of anything that you normally put in your basket of goods and services that you purchase at gallons of gasoline, when the price of anything you normally purchase goes up, then your real income goes down. Your real income is the amount of stuff you can purchase on your nominal income, your dollar income. So, I mean, if you got 10 gallons of gas in your shopping basket, okay, and the price of that goes up and you're always living on $200 a week, guess what? You're going to have to throw something out of your basket, okay? So, that's because your real income went down. Heck, you kept making $200 a week. The boss didn't cut your salary, but the price of gasoline went up. That's the income effect. And we have ways of picturing that. I kind of wanted to mention this here just a little bit. I would like for you, there's a discussion at the end of chapter 7 where we talk about consumer preference theory just a little bit. In the appendix to chapter 7, they talk about utility curves and so forth. And we'll have a way of picturing that when we get to chapter 7. But I would like for you to, when you get a chance, go ahead and read the appendix to chapter 7. And we will dwell on these 2 things later, but not today. Okay? So, at any rate, when you change a quantity demanded, you change Q or capital Q by changing the price. When you're in this system, price versus quantity, you trace along any curve. I could draw any curve here. As long as you stay on that paper, you're only changing these 2 variables here. When you change any other variable, then you actually will have to shift that curve. So for instance, there's some other things here, some other parameters, if you will, that we might change that will affect the position of this curve here. And that's when you're actually changing demand. So first off, make sure you have this straight. When you go from point A to B or something similar, that's a change in what? Quantity demanded. Okay, that's a change in quantity demanded. A change in demand is a shift of the demand curve. Okay, so the price may not change at all. I'll put a hat over price here, a bar. That just means price doesn't change. But one week the market may, or the individual consumer may purchase 10 gallons of gasoline. So if there's 100 people in the economy, that'd be 1,000. The next week it might be 1,500. Now why in the world? The price of gasoline does not change. But in the second week, people across the market may be willing and able to purchase more gasoline. There's more demand than there was previously because something else changed. So we talked here about determinants, okay? These are the things that determinants that determine the position of the demand curve. We'll have determinants for supply in a little bit, but these were listed in your text beginning on page 47, but they have a chart on page 51 of your text. So should know these. I just run through these. Change the number well, let me do change the number of buyers first. Okay, so I used funeral home services and so forth last time, so that's going to increase the demand. There'll be a rightward shift in the demand for funeral home services and so forth as my generation, baby boomers, I'm a baby boomer, as baby boomers get older. So if you can anticipate that, okay, you might, as a potential investor, you might take advantage of that. Say, hey, there's a wave coming here. We have now a fall off in the population of young people going to college here in the next few years. They call it the enrollment cliff, something like that. So if you know that, then you might take advantage of that information. In that case, the demand for college textbooks and everything related to college is going to shift to the left if that's the case in just a few short years. If indeed there is a what they call, I guess they call it an enrollment cliff. If that happens, then there'll be a decrease in the number of buyers and a leftward shift in the demand curve. Other things that might cause the demand curve to shift, the change in buyer taste. We talked about that. You know, suddenly people want, say, fitness items and what have you, but there's good news that comes out about doing a lot of exercise every day, and that'll extend your life and so forth. People go out and buy treadmills, okay, and bikes and so forth. That's just an example. Change in buyer taste, change in income. If your income goes up, for most goods, there'll be a rightward shift in the demand curve. That's called an increase in demand. Is that true for all goods? No. We have a class of goods, not very many in that class, but for which you can observe a decrease or leftward shift in the market demand curve as the typical consumer has an increase in income. And those are called income inferior goods, or just inferior goods in short. So we've looked at examples of those, okay? I won't go back through that. Change in prices of related goods. So we talked about price of gasoline goes up. That's going to affect the market for luxury automobiles and so forth, or speedboats, okay? I mean, if the price of gasoline goes up, you used to own a boat years ago. I mean, our family did. Maybe you own one too. Man, there's nothing that guzzles gasoline, it seemed to me. Nothing like a boat, okay? So my dad used to joke. I just remember he said the happiest day of his life, I guess next to when he came to know the Lord maybe, but second happiest day of his life was when he bought a boat. He'd say, the happiest day of my life is when I bought a boat. The second happiest day of my life is when I sold it. So, and that was a point well taken, because he was glad to get a boat, but gosh, boats guzzle gasoline. Well, if you got a boat and the price of gasoline goes up, you want to get rid of that boat, perhaps. So the demand for boats and luxury craft and those sorts of things are affected by the price of a related good. Okay, so if the price of gasoline goes up, there's fewer of those you want. Change in consumer expectations. If you think the price of oil is going to go up tomorrow because there's a war going on in the Middle East or what have you, then you're apt to go out and buy gasoline today. I remember this quite well in the here's how old I am, I'll date myself. But in the 1970s, I was alive then. That was a long time ago. There were two instances in particular in the 1970s where the price of gasoline just went up like threefold. I mean, just remember it doubling at least. One was in the wake of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. But you know, we have experienced this in our time too. But you know that whenever there's a little saber rattling going on, especially in the Middle East, there's the potential for an increase in the price of petroleum products coming into the U.S. So if you see some political instability in the Middle East, you may go ahead and buy gasoline and so forth. Now, during the COVID thing, the price of certain oils, refined products went to zero. And I don't remember the details exactly, but people didn't want gasoline and so forth because we were shut down. People weren't traveling. And so if you had a bunch of even gasoline on your hands, you had to store it somewhere. Or unrefined crude oil, what have you. You had to store it somewhere, so you didn't want it, okay? There have been a few episodes like that. So at any rate, if you can anticipate those events occurring, that'll affect the position of this demand curve today. So today we want to look at the supply side. Okay, so we're going to slap another curve on this same system, prices versus quantity, but instead I'm going to draw an upward sloping curve. So let's just go back here just a second. Your book doesn't spend much time in explaining why the supply curve slopes upward, but I'll put an S here. Okay, the supply curve is, has a positive relationship between price and the quantity that suppliers are willing to bring to market. So if price goes up, then we see here that the quantity supplied by suppliers will increase as well. So there's a direct relation, not an inverse relation, but a direct relationship between these two variables here in a market along the supply curve. So a change in supply, like a change in, a change in quantity supplied, like a change in quantity demanded, is a movement along the supply curve. Okay, so if we talk about increase, and here's where people get sloppy and we have problems. Increase in supply. There's been an increase in supply. Well, this is not an increase in supply. This is an increase in quantity supplied. An increase in supply will be, what do you think, class? What would denote in this diagram, or how would I picture an increase in supply? What do you think? How did we do with demand? Okay, yeah, we shifted the curve, right? So we're going to do the same thing here with an increase in supply. That's going to be a rightward shift. So I'm going to go from S1 to S2. It may be that the price is constant, okay, but suppliers are willing to bring more to the market, okay. All right, so a couple things we're going to do here to follow the pattern we did for demand. Here we're talking about supply. First thing I want to talk about is, why is the supply curve upward? Why is price and quantity supplied directly related? Okay? And then we'll talk about shifts in supply, or increases in supply. Okay, so why is this the case? Well, all right. First off, I think, this appeals to our intuition in that anyone, say, imagine you're a farmer here and you just got a field out there, it's been lying fallow for a while, and you get news that the price of wheat is really going up for some reason. Well, you are going to be inclined to plant wheat, right? I mean, higher prices incline people to bring to market. Now, there's a little more to it than that, but that's kind of the common sense, gut level explanation for why the supply curve slopes upward. Suppliers have to be rewarded, though, with a higher price to bring more to market. When you look at individual suppliers, okay, individual suppliers, and we're going to get to this more when we talk about production theory later, but individual suppliers must be rewarded somehow to bring additional, and when I say additional here, I mean marginal, okay, marginal units of good to market. Okay, I hope you can read my writing here. Okay, so, you know, if again the price of soybeans goes up, there's people out there who perhaps have been growing cotton, they'll instead grow soybeans, or if it goes up enough, they'll plow under their cotton and plant soybeans. But they have to be rewarded to behave that way. Suppliers have to be rewarded to behave that way. And that's because, okay, economists in what's called in the short run, okay, we'll be talking about this more later, what the short run is. But in the short run, we have something called law of increasing marginal cost. Increasing marginal cost of production. Okay, I'm going to make a simple example here to illustrate what I'm talking about. First off, in the short run, I'm just talking about here, a finite period of time where economists say the short run's not necessarily 6 months, it might be a year or something like that, but you as a producer have something you have to live with, something you can't change. In the long run, you can change everything. So I'm going to talk here just a minute about a baseball bat factory, okay? The reason I want to do that is because we all know what a baseball bat is, and you know, we can envision a very simple process for making baseball bats. So you have stock lumber that comes in here, and you have a chop saw. Okay, so you have a chop saw, and you have a lathe over here. Okay, so you chop this hickory up, and you put it on a lathe, and you spin it, and maybe you got, and then you know you got a finisher, and then you have a well, with the finisher, you apply the finish. Let me just leave it with 3 workstations like this. You might have shipping here too. I kind of wanted to do that. Shipping. So the chop saw, we imagine what that is. Chop, chop, chop. You got these sections of lumber. You got a lathe, spins it, makes a bat. Here you put the lacquer on. Not liquor, but lacquer, right? I'm told they're 2 different things. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But you put the lacquer on there, it makes it nice and shiny, and then you ship it out. Okay. Now, can you imagine one person working in this factory? One person could work in this factory. They'd spend some time here, and they'd run over here. There'd be a little time between tasks, and then they'd take some baseball bats, you know, and that have already been turned on the lathe, and then they'd go over here to the finisher, and then they'd go over here and box up a dozen or what have you, and then they're on their way. One person could perhaps operate that factory, but of course there's a lot of time between tasks and a lot of inefficiency. So you put a second worker in here, okay? Put a second worker. Now here's the deal. What's nice about putting a second worker in here is if you start one here and you start one here, they could probably go in a circle and not get in each other's way, okay? So 2 people could probably double your output because there's no congestion, okay? There's no congestion. So you have no congestion. Okay, initially there's no congestion. That's what I'm going to say here. Initially when you hire workers, there's no congestion. Now what if you had 3 workers? Well, they might start bumping into each other, but guess what? If you have 3 workers and ideally 4 workers, you might really be able, this factory may really be able to hum along because you can put 1 worker or assign 1 worker to each of the 4 stations. You can specialize. So if you specialize, there'd be no congestion either, okay? But if you know, I mean, you know this and I know this is very intuitive. If you do the same thing all day long, every day, you get really good at it, right? And so this factory can really pump them out. So it's likely, okay, notice a couple things. If you double from 1 to 2, you double the workforce here, so you may be able to double output simply because there's no congestion. But it's when you quadruple the workforce, you may be able to more than quadruple output. You may be able to increase output by tenfold instead of fourfold. Why? Because every worker specializes. Okay, we know that. So additional baseball bats, say next week we want to produce just a few more bats than we did last week. Those bats are pretty cheap to produce because we are really humming along. But you got this factory here. In the short run, you can't expand your factory. So in the short run, say you want to really push output out and you hire a bunch more workers. Okay? Well, you can do that, but what's going to happen eventually? Okay? So initially and eventually, what's going to happen when I want to produce more baseball bats next week than I did this week by hiring a bunch more workers? What do you think is going to happen? I'm going to get congestion, aren't I? Congestion. Does that make sense? So that'll nullify this thing right here, the gains to be had from specialization. It'll nullify that. Now, so what's that saying? That in a length of time during which you got to live with a fixed input. We call that the short run in economics. So you can't change the floor size. If you can't change the floor size, you have to build another factory. If you can't do that and you want to increase output, guess what? The additional output gets more and more expensive. The additional or marginal units that you want to produce, that is the extra units you want to produce next week that you're not producing this week, are going to become very expensive. I mean, you're going to have to start working people 24 hours around the clock and so forth. And at some point, you're going to hit the wall. All right. So that's just kind of briefly a description of something we're going to talk about in Chapter 6, I believe it is. In Chapter 6, we're going to spend more time talking about increasing marginal cost of production. Increasing marginal cost of production. Whenever you produce anything in a finite period of time, say units of time of week 1, week 2, week 3, you're delivering apples to the market. I used this example the other day with the orchard, right? Apple orchard. You've been taking a truckload every week. You just go out and see these apples. You take them to the market every week. Next week, you want to take 2 truckloads. Guess what? You're not just going to pick the low-hanging fruit then. You're going to have to reach deeper into your resources, get the cherry picker out and so forth. You have increasing marginal cost of production. Anytime you have a situation like this, okay, you want to have an orchard of certain length. Now, if you had an infinitely sized orchard, you could just go around and pick low-hanging fruit all day long. Okay. But the thing is, practically speaking, in the real world, producers have finite resources. They may have a variable resource like labor, but if they want to push production higher and higher, then those additional units get more and more costly. Increasing marginal cost. Every producer has an increasing marginal cost curve. I'm just going to write it right here. MC, increasing marginal cost. Increasing marginal cost. What do I mean by that? I mean that as you produce more and more units, more and more apples to market, those additional apples, crates of apples, what have you, come at a higher cost. So there's going to be a higher cost. That's called an individual marginal cost curve. We'll be looking at that more later. I don't want to get too deep into this because we will come back to it. I think it's in Chapter 6 later. But I just want to mention this. An individual marginal cost curve is an individual supply curve. There we finally got to the idea. Individual supply curve is a marginal cost curve. Just a moment ago I said individual suppliers must be rewarded to bring additional or the marginal units of a good to market. Sorry for my writing there. But individual suppliers have to be rewarded to bring additional units to the market that they haven't brought to the market previously, say on a weekly basis or what have you. That's because the cost of producing, the marginal cost of producing is an increasing curve. All right. So I know there's a lot of concepts there, kind of spoke abstractly there just a little bit. But individual suppliers face an upward sloping marginal cost curve. This thing right here is an individual supply curve. See, you have individual supply, just as you had individual demand. We talked about individual demand curves last time. This is an individual supply curve. It's upward sloping because of the law of increasing marginal cost. Now, how do you think we get the market supply curve? This is an individual supply curve. The market supply curve is found by horizontally adding, just like we did the demand curves, horizontally adding the individual supply curves over the economy. So you add horizontally, not vertically, because the independent variable is on the vertical axis. You add these curves horizontally, and you will get this curve here we call a supply curve. Okay, just upward, that I just now put on here. I'll put a capital Q here. And again, I got price on the vertical axis because, again, suppliers have to be rewarded with a higher price to bring additional units to the market because those additional units come at a higher cost. It's that simple. Okay, so I want you to think deeper about this than what you have before, because on one level, on the surface level, everybody says, well, yeah, a higher price, I'm going to plant more wheat. Yeah, I'm a farmer and I grow oats and I grow barley and I grow corn, this and that. But I heard the price of wheat goes up. Everybody wants wheat for some reason. Yeah, price goes up. I'm going to grow more wheat. Well, one reason you do that, main reason you do that, is because those additional units that you want to bring to market at some point come with a higher cost. And so the only way you would do that is you'd have to be rewarded with a higher price. Okay, we will be talking more about that in production theory later. But first thing, just like with demand, I asked that you do two things. Know why there's a law of demand. So we looked at some reasons there. I also want you to know why there's a law of supply. The law of supply basically says that when the price of a good goes up, suppliers want to bring more to market. Okay, so a movement along a supply curve is an increase in quantity supplied, but a shift in the supply curve, say from left to right, would be an increase in supply. Okay, that would be an increase in supply. So the second thing we want to talk about with respect to supply are these determinants. Okay, what are the determinants of supply? I'm doing a lot of writing here. I'm used to kind of having this on PowerPoint for the book, but kind of resolving an issue on that right now with some folks. So at any rate, if you'll bear with me, this is in your text here, but there are some things here that determine the position of the supply curve. These are listed on page 54 of your text. And so just like we talked about change in buyers and so forth for determining the position of the demand, you have determinants for position of supply, like change in resource prices. Change in resource prices. Resource prices. Okay, so think about home building for a minute. Or if there's been a lot of fires in the Pacific Northwest and so forth, so the price of lumber goes up. Price of lumber goes up. Well, lumber's used in home building. Okay, price of concrete could go up, or the price of asphalt for shingles could go up. There's lots of different stories we could talk about. But how do you think that would affect the supply of new homes on the market? Would that increase the supply, that is, cause a rightward shift in the supply of new homes? This were the market for new homes, okay, quantity and price here. Or would it decrease the supply of new homes? Again, if there's an increase in a resource price like lumber, that's right. So it's going to just kind of use your head there. Now, why is that? Your book kind of gives you a discussion of that, but it says higher resource prices raise production cost and squeeze profits. Okay, so if you squeeze profits, that is, you have a reduction in profits, that's going to reduce firms' incentive to supply output at each price. So I guess just kind of simply, I won't write a description on each one of these. But price increase, when I say a price increase, price in a resource increases, this squeezes profits. And if profits are squeezed, if you're a home builder, say, you're going to get out of the home building. So this would decrease demand. Say, okay? If there's been a decrease in resource, I'll tell you one resource that's for something that's a resource for just about everything in our economy is petroleum, right? We refine it to make gasoline, to transport goods and this and that. So what if there's been a decrease in the price of gasoline for some reason? You know, we've experienced that in your lifetime. When you stand back at this, you realize what happens in a resource market affects what happens in product markets. But there's been an increase in supply of petroleum goods because of fracking and all that, right? So you have that, so the price of gasoline goes down. Guess what? Anything that's made from gasoline or petroleum or transported by petroleum and so forth, that's going to increase. And I said demand here. I should have said supply. Forgive me here. That's going to increase profits. If there's a decrease in the price of an input, that's going to increase profits, and hence that will increase the supply on the product market. Okay? So whatever the product is. So milk is transported using these big tankers that run on diesel. If diesel goes down, there's going to be an increased supply of milk in the product market. I guess hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Second thing I mentioned here, changes in technology. Okay, let me give you from history an example here. This is controversial, and I don't want us to get hung up on this today, but there's some thought that slavery was kind of on its way out, on the path to extinction in the United States in the early 19th century. It was on its way to extinction, but someone figured out a way to make slavery pay. And does anybody know what I'm alluding to? That's kind of a famous, do what? Yeah, there you go. You got it. Exactly. Boom. You nailed it. Eli Whitney and the cotton gin. Okay? The cotton gin. The cotton gin came along. My dad worked in a cotton gin for 50 cents an hour. I've heard that all the time growing up. Cotton gins were around even as late as when my dad was a kid. But when the cotton gin was invented, then growing cotton was, wow, that was really profitable. There was a supply. The South began to export cotton around the world and so forth. And one reason we have in the U.S. Constitution, there's a prohibition on, I won't say the word tariffs, we're talking about tariffs here, on export tariffs, not import tariffs. A lot of political discussion about import tariffs, but there was a prohibition, there's a prohibition in the U.S. Constitution on export tariffs. And why is that? It was when the Constitution was drawn up to get the support of the South, the political support of the southern states. The Union agreed that there'd never be an export tariff on things like cotton. Okay, let's not tax cotton, because that was becoming then early on when the Constitution was drafted, but it certainly became so in the early part of the 19th century. Cotton really began to pay off because there was technological changes that made the South an exporter of cotton. Okay? And then the South had to compete with other parts of the world like Egypt later on in producing cotton. But we had the cotton gin here first. It was invented in the United States. It was used in the United States. You had an increase in technology, increase the supply of cotton. Now, I'm old enough, here I go dating myself again, but I worked in the area of the federal government that had a lot of technology. If I talked about it a little bit, you'd say, well, they should have had everything. But when I went to work for the federal government before you were born, in the early 1980s, people didn't have desktop computers. You just didn't have, no one had a computer. If you wanted to use a computer, even to do word processing and so forth, and where I was, you had to go to a special room and so forth. There weren't computers around. Just think about how the laptop itself has made us all much more productive. So much more productive. We can do so much more. So now we have the advent of AI and all of these things. As these things come along, we'll be more productive. Now, one thing's for sure, okay, there's always disruptions that attend changes in technology. Okay, I mentioned last time, when's the last time you talked to a blacksmith? Okay, those are things now that, and you say you're going to be a pharmacist, you might do all the compounding by hand, pull the drugs off the shelf and get the mortar and pestle out. All because of technology, all that's done somewhere else. So you might find yourself just kind of counting pills then. But we're doing a lot more today because of technology. So now we're experiencing the rise of AI. AI is going to be very disruptive. So you got to watch that. Try to anticipate where things are going. Hopefully, it's not going to put too many white-collar workers out of work, but everybody says there'll be a few folks kind of be displaced because of the rise of AI. But one thing's for sure. I mean, there's going to be some pain. But if history is any guide, the productivity of the average person on a per capita basis or per worker basis is going to increase. We will become more productive as a culture, as a society, because even with AI, there'll be much more produced in the way of goods and services. So changes in technology. There's lots of examples we could cite from history. Changes in taxes and subsidies. I keep putting this word changes here. So changes in taxes and subsidies. So we raise the tax on excise tax on cigarettes, say, reduces the supply of cigarettes. That's the example of your book. The federal government loves to slap taxes on tobacco goods and alcoholic goods. Okay, we'll look at more later when we talk about price elasticities, why they select those goods in particular, and also gasoline. So I think the motor fuel tax in the U.S. is 17 cents a gallon. But if they were to raise that, if they were to double that overnight, guess what? Suppliers, look at that. More taxes, squeeze our profits. I mean, some of the tax gets passed on to the consumer, but not all of the tax gets passed on to the consumer. You hear that a lot. We're going to look at that. We're going to scrutinize that statement later. But when you hear, a lot of times when there's a proposal to raise a tax on a good or raise a sales tax or so forth, we say, well, that's just going to be passed on to the consumer. It turns out, it's always the case, a portion of the tax gets passed on. But also the other portion, well, the supplier has to eat that, if you will. So if you raise a tax on gasoline, okay, suppliers of gasoline, oil companies, petroleum companies, if they know there's an increase in motor fuel tax across the board in the United States, that's going to have an adverse effect on supply. That's going to decrease supply. Okay, so, if you want less of something, you tax it. Okay? If you want more of it, you provide a subsidy. So in agricultural markets and so forth, we have agricultural markets, as a matter of fact, in the U.S. because there are subsidies. If it weren't for subsidies on, say, price supports for milk to dairy farmers and so forth, a lot of people wouldn't go into dairy farming. Okay, just think about that a second. You know any dairy farmers? Okay, yeah. If milk is one of those fairly heavily subsidized agricultural goods, if the government, and there's a couple ways they do it. Sometimes they give direct payments to dairy farmers. Well, we want you producing milk. But if it weren't for that, there would be fewer dairy farmers. So just kind of use your head on that. We'll look at some examples of that later. Probably come back to that example. Changes the prices of other goods. Okay, changes in prices of other goods. Okay, we talked about this actually. The same line we used is a determinant of demand when we talked about substitutes and complements in consumption. Here we talk about substitutes and complements in production, not consumption, but in production. Okay? Your book, you know, some of these can be kind of, artificial, some of these examples, if you will, but I think this one illustrates it. Your book talks about firms that produce a particular product, say soccer balls, can sometimes use their plant and equipment to produce alternative goods, say basketballs or volleyballs. So, I mean, not very many people out there make soccer balls, but but it's easy to understand. See, this is an example we can follow. So you got a firm that makes soccer balls, and suddenly everybody wants a basketball or volleyball. I don't know why. Maybe it's because, you know, there's the NBA finals and it's great this year. The Thunder is in there and so forth. Whatever, you know. So a firm that makes soccer balls may produce a substitute good. Okay? So it could be if everybody wants basketballs, the price of basketballs goes up, and you've been making soccer balls, well, you're going to switch, right? So it would have a decreased supply, a leftward shift in the supply curve here for the market for soccer balls and so forth. We'll come back and look at some more examples of that later. Producer expectations. So there could be a change in producer expectations. Okay, so if you're a farmer and you expect wheat to be priced higher in the future, there's a coming demand for wheat, then you're going to supply wheat today. Okay, if you think there's a glut of wheat, somehow you know what's going on with wheat on the market, you know, with storage and so forth on the global scene, and you say, hey, there's a glut of wheat, there's a shortage of capacity to store wheat, then you may see that coming. You say, hey, other suppliers are going to start discounting the price of wheat, so I'm not going to grow wheat this week or this year. Okay, so there's a change in producer expectations affecting the position or determining the position of the supply curve. And then lastly here, number of sellers. So there could be a change in number of sellers. Just as we had before with number of demanders, now we have suppliers. Sellers, sorry class. Number of sellers, and this is in your text. So, all right, so obviously, you know, if you have an increase in the number of sellers or suppliers, there'll be an increase in market supply. Your book talks about that when Uber and other ride-sharing services made their debut, millions of additional drivers in their cars, like taxi drivers and so forth, kind of were displaced because suddenly you had everybody in that line of work. Imagine how Uber has affected the supply of taxi services and transport services in a large city in the U.S. It's not hard to get out of the airport today like it used to be. Hail a taxi. You know, I remember, I don't travel much anymore, but remember when I did, sometimes it'd be hard to get out of the airport. Now you got Uber and so forth there that provide those services as well. So you have an increase in the number of sellers. Okay. So these are things that would change the position of the supply curve. Okay, so what we've done here is we've produced a model that will kind of explain the market value for a good. Whoops, let me get something better than that. Let me try it again here, class. Okay, so you got price and you got quantity. Supply and demand. There's our two curves, supply and demand. Got price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. Now, this model here, if you will, the supply-demand model, we've talked about why these two curves slope the way they do and why they are positioned the way they are, what would affect their position. But where these 2 points cross here is called the equilibrium point. This is called equilibrium. We're going to look at why here in just a minute. But there's a price, I'll call it PEQ, equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, that's established by the market. And this price right here tells you, as far as the market's concerned, what the value of the commodity, good or service is. Whatever the good or service, the market will place a value on a unit of that good that is equal to the price coordinate of this point. Now, this seems like a simple model here, but I'll tell you, it has not, even with great minds, it was not really not thought of for a long time. Even Adam Smith, we talk about Adam Smith being a great economist, father of modern economics, but he appreciated what was called the labor theory of value. Labor theory of, I'd like for you to remember that just a little bit. We might read on the labor theory of value. Adam Smith said, basically, or thought, that the value of an object was really determined by the amount of effort that was used to produce it. Okay? The amount of effort that was used to produce it. Now, I will tell you, he had an appreciation for this side of the market. Remember, I was talking about marginal cost of production and so forth? There was some appreciation for this side of the market, but that's only half the story. Yeah, you can spend all day making a chair, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you've increased the value of the chair simply because you've worked on it longer. Okay? Because somebody has to buy the chair. Okay? You have to have a demand side as well. It's the demand and supply working together that determines what the market will place a value on that particular good or service at. Even especially Karl Marx advanced the labor theory of value. There was kind of a thinking for a long time that the value of a good or service is determined by the cost associated with producing it. But alas, you can spend all day, all year, whatever you, working on a unit of output to bring to market, but if no one will buy it, then as far as the market's concerned, it has little value. Okay, so you have to have supply and demand working together, and we'll talk more about the history of economic thought later, how this more or less came about with Stanley Jevons and so forth, but it's these two curves working together that set the price at which the good will be exchanged in the market and the quantity of the good or service that will be exchanged in the market. Price and quantity is set by the intersection of the supply and demand curve. There's a picture of this in your text. I'm going to go ahead and step over the line here a little bit, just say, here's a picture of this in your text. I want you to see this. Okay, supply and demand curve. I want you to spend some time studying this. By the way, you got to have the text for this class anyway. So, but supply and demand. Notice where these two curves intersect. Okay, they intersect at a price of $3 per gallon. This is for gasoline, and a quantity of 7,000 gallons per week. Do y'all see that? Let me back that off. 7,000 gallons per week. At a price of $3 a gallon, the market is said to clear. Okay, I want you to remember that word, clear. A market clears when there's neither a shortage or a surplus. So you can imagine for a second, say, I'll just give you an example, another example here. Suppose that there's going to be a community-wide garage sale downtown this Saturday, and everybody is encouraged to bring your shoes, old shoes, to the market to sell, because a lot of people need shoes and they can't afford it. Maybe the price of leather's gone up, what have you. So everybody brings their shoes, but also a lot of people come to buy shoes. The market will clear if at the end of the day there are no shoes left for sale and there's no people looking for shoes to buy. It's said to clear. A market clears when the number or quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. That is to say, the distance to the demand curve equals the distance, horizontal distance here to the supply curve. A market wouldn't clear if there were a bunch of shoes left over at the end of the day, or if there were a bunch of people at the end of the day saying, well, I want to buy some shoes, I can't find any. In which case you'd have either a surplus or a shortage. So this is called the market equilibrium point. This is where markets will gravitate to. We know this instinctively, okay? This is something you already have a feel for. Why? Okay? For instance, if the price of gasoline were $4 a gallon, the quantity supplied by this diagram is how many thousand gallons in a week? Can you tell? Can you tell from the diagram? If the price of gasoline's high, a lot of producers are going to want to sell gasoline, but not very many people want to buy gasoline. So my question here is, how many units will be brought to market? You look down here from the supply curve, you look at this point, and you come down, you'll see there'll be 10,000 gallons brought to market each week. 10,000 gallons in a week that has the price of gasoline at $4 a gallon. Okay, 10,000 gallons. But how many gallons will be demanded at $4 a gallon? That is, how many gallons are people willing and able to purchase? Well, here you come out to the demand curve. And you come down here. Remember, this is the independent axis here, variable axis. And there's 4,000 gallons demanded. There's 10,000 supplied. There's 4,000 demanded. 10 minus 4 gives you 6,000 gallons left over. There's a surplus of gasoline when the price is, for the moment, above equilibrium at $4 a gallon. So if the price of gasoline for some reason was at $4 a gallon, it's not going to stay there very long unless the government comes in and says it has to be for some reason. We'll look at that in just a minute. But if the price of gasoline is here at $4 a gallon, then it shouldn't be there very long because there's a surplus of gasoline. And we all know that when there's a surplus of a good or service, there's a bidding process that takes place between buyers and sellers. Is there not? I mean, the sellers say, I don't want to pay $4, I'll pay $3.90, $3.80. As long as there is a surplus, buyers are going to demand a cheaper price. And that'll put downward pressure on the price of gasoline until what evaporates? Not the gasoline, but the surplus. The surplus will evaporate. Okay, so that next week, okay, the price of gasoline comes down. There may still be a surplus, but not as big. So then the next week, the price comes down even further and the surplus shrinks even more. As long as there's a surplus, there's a downward pressure on the price. Okay, so that's a self-correcting force, if you will, in a free market. We're talking a free market here that drives prices that are artificially high toward this equilibrium price of $3 a gallon. What if the price of gasoline were at $2 a gallon? Wow, that's cheap, isn't it? $2 a gallon. I want to drive my big gas hog to work. So everybody knows I got a great big Escalade with all this stuff. I don't, but it drinks a lot of gasoline. Whatever it is, I'll drive that to work because gasoline is only $2 a gallon. Everybody does that. Okay, guess what? The demand outstrips the supply. The demand could be way out here and the supply only here. There's a shortage. Now there's, again, a bidding process that takes place, negotiation between buyers and sellers, but this time it's the sellers that have the upper hand, right? Because there's a shortage. And the sellers are going to say, I'm not going to take just $2 a gallon, I need $2.50, and maybe the next week they'll say $2.60 and so forth. So that there is over time an upward pressure on the market price toward that price at which the market clears. That's the term again. The market clears when the quantity supplied to the market equals the quantity demanded. Okay? That's when the market clears. Okay, so we call this equilibrium price of $3, equilibrium quantity of 7,000 gallons, okay, in a week. Now we're gonna look at finding this with some examples later. We'll algebraically describe these two curves with a couple of equations. We'll do that. I don't think we'll get to that today, but we will next time. But at least from a chart like this, you just see here we've got quantity supplied and quantity demanded at various prices for gasoline. So there you have You have a supply schedule, you have a demand schedule. Notice that the market clears, they'll tell you here, the market clears at a price of $3 a gallon, and there's 7,000 gallons that would be exchanged. And so there's neither a surplus nor a shortage in that case. Okay, so I mean, you would think then, okay, that's naturally where a market wants to be. A market naturally wants to be here. Why would a market find itself at a price too high or too low? Where the market is not clearing, where the quantity demanded does not equal the quantity supplied. Well, let me tell you why that might happen. It could happen because you might have a change in either the supply or demand curve. Okay, here's supply and demand again, supply and demand, supply, demand. We've talked about what a change in demand is. A change in demand would be a shift in the demand curve. So what I'm drawing here is an increase in demand. Okay, that's an increase in demand. A rightward shift in the demand curve. Now, this is supply, I'll call it S1, and D1 is initially where the market is. I'll call this P1 and this Q1. Okay, I'll be drawing these kind of whoops, let me back off. I'll be drawing these diagrams fairly frequently. So it's the market for gasoline, okay? Market for gasoline. That means initially it's here. Something caused the demand for gasoline to increase. Not the quantity demanded, but the demand for gasoline to increase. So there's been an increase in demand for gasoline. So what's happened? Well, we've talked about what might cause a rightward shift in the demand curve. Here's a story. There's news that there's about to be a war in the Middle East. I'm going to go out and fill my gas guzzling vehicle up today. I remember when people would do this. They'd run out in the 70s when there's a threat of any kind of war. People would go out and fill their tanks up as if, you know, having a full tank of gas made a big difference in their standard of living. But if that were the case, that would cause an increase in the demand for gasoline. Well, guess what? What results then when there's a sudden increase in the demand for gasoline? You have this thing, don't you? Is that a shortage or a surplus? All right, right here at this price, okay, you kind of ignore where the demand curve was and look at where it is now. The quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. So this would be a shortage. Okay, that would be a shortage. So I'm just going to do a couple of these for us to think about it just a little bit. There's a shortage that occurs because there's a sudden shift in one of these, well, in the demand curve. So because there's a shortage, then there's this bidding process between buyers and sellers that we talked about that will have an upward pressure on prices so that equilibrium now is established up here at P2. Okay, and this would be Q2. And a lot of times we'll put a little star there because it applies to equilibrium, different things there. But the main thing I want you to see here is because of an increase in demand, there is an increase in the market price of gasoline. There was an increase in demand, not in quantity demanded. Okay, again, let's just back off here a second and compare these two. For a stationary demand curve related to gasoline, there might be an increase in quantity demanded for reasons other than what we see here. Okay, thank you. For instance, suppose, since gasoline, is a normal good and people's incomes have gone up, people want to buy more gasoline, okay? Well, that would shift the demand curve here, and that's what the situation is you have here. But here, if people want to buy more gasoline simply because the price has fallen, and I'm going to call this P1 and P2, the price of gasoline has fallen, that will cause a movement along the demand curve this way from Q1 to Q2. Now in this case you have an increase in quantity demanded of gasoline. This is an increase in demand for gasoline. Notice when there's an increase in quantity demanded for gasoline, the price goes down. When there's an increase in demand for gasoline, the price does what? Goes up. All right. So, you want to keep this straight just a little bit. Use the terminology. There's a difference between an increase in quantity demanded, which would cause a downward pressure on price, and an increase in demand, which would cause an upward pressure in the market price of gasoline. Now, this is just a price down here, just a price on the curve that we're observing. The market price is really established by its intersection with the supply curve. So this could happen here if there were a right shift in the supply curve. Okay, notice that. Something happened to the supply side of the curve, shifted the supply curve out, that would cause this intersection to go down. So notice there's an increase in supply caused an increase in quantity demanded of gasoline. Okay? Whereas up here, there's an increase in demand affected an increase in quantity supplied. Because the supply curve is just sitting there. Okay? So, you got a lot going on here that you want to keep straight. I'm trying to get this in our hour and 15 minutes, but I want you to see right here at the high level view, 35,000 foot view, is you have two curves, supply and demand. You can shift either curve or not shift them. And if you shift the curves, you shift them either left or right. There's lots of possibilities here, okay? So we will first, kind of methodically, your book goes through these different disruptions in a market. First off, they talk about changes in demand and supply and its effect, effect on equilibrium. There's this little picture here in your text. I want you to spend some time with this. You'll see that we, in these four pictures, are shifting only one of the two curves. We're shifting only one. So here, there's a shift in the demand curve from left to right, from right to left. Okay, here we're shifting the supply curve from left to right and right to left. If you spend some time on this, you'll get it, okay? It's just kind of a simple discussion like we just did. Okay, now you get more complex cases. Your book talks about this, where you shift both curves, or wouldn't you know it? Okay, so they have some pictures of this, I thought, in your text. Like here, you're going to see this market for pink salmon here. Notice we have a couple things going on. You got a rightward shift in the supply curve and a leftward shift in the demand curve. That's going to affect market equilibrium. Now, at first, again, you got price and you got quantity here. At first, you may be tempted to kind of pull your hair out just a little bit. But what I want to encourage you to do is think and reason this, not memorize a bunch of stuff. It's not that difficult, okay? If you draw the pictures. You got to draw the pictures.